Hey everybody, welcome to another Flexible Dieting Institute research review. We did a part one of the science of artificial sweeteners in 2021. So I'm going to conclude with some of those remarks as a contrast to what we uncovered today. But there is an often cited meta-analysis that came out, I want to say no, gosh, it's been 8 or 9 years ago now. This meta-analysis, which was, I think, kind of a big deal. It was published in Nature and the International Journal of Obesity. So it really shook the ground a little bit on a controversial topic. Does low energy sweetener consumption affect energy intake and body weight? A systematic review, including meta-analyses of the evidence from human and animal studies. So on the surface, when I started looking at this, I was pretty excited to dig in because I personally have some biases against artificial sweeteners. I have a ton of anecdotal evidence, which I'm going to share. I'm going to go through some of the neuro and gastrointestinal physiology that explains some of my concerns. But at the same time, science is ever evolving. When you do look at meta-analyses and you start looking at inclusion criteria and sifting through outliers, and you're comparing epidemiology studies to animal models or human models and longitudinal studies, you really get different pictures of the contextual uniqueness of each particular study. So even though this one has been out for a while, and I have heard many, many people cite little quips and little conclusions, I had really not dug into this one. So let's take a look. So one of the things you would notice right up front is that there were a lot of studies to choose from, and their inclusion criteria was kind of tight. So that always makes me concerned. What are you looking at? What are you leaving out? What are you filtering for? That's always a first red flag for people who have an agenda, but it doesn't mean anything. It's also an important part of research. You want to look at things where you can compare apples to apples as often as possible. So out of 90 animal studies, and we talked about this a couple sessions ago, that animal studies are fine. They really do show us a lot, and it gives us a uniqueness in that they don't necessarily have the same behavioral biases that we do. We can sometimes consider them a little bit more reflexive, like in the wild, here's what this biological organism would do. And that kind of gets it to a more primal basis to make comparisons to us, especially when you have mammals that have such similar physiologies. So I think rats, if the last time I think I looked it up, they have about 94 95% identical genomes to us. But out of the 90 animal studies they looked at, 62 did not affect weight. So there wasn't really weight gain or weight loss. 28 did show weight gain with low energy sweeteners. When you see that LES, that acronym, low energy sweeteners, so 28 showed weight gain, but it was when they compared those low energy or artificial sweeteners to glucose. So if you are going to do an ad libitum feeding exposure, so you're about ready to unleash these mice into a trough of food and they could eat whatever they want, unlimited. But you preload them first with a sugary drink or an artificial sweetener laced drink. And then they wanted to compare those reactions, who ate more, if it was just one exposure, if it was multiple exposures over time. Some of these studies went up to a year. What effect was there on body weight? So 28 showed weight gain, 19 of which compared the low energy sweeteners to glucose. So that's an important caveat because we're going to look at about 4 other ways they studied this. 12 human cohort studies, so now looking at people, showed inconsistent associations, and we're going to break those down. A meta-analysis of 129 random controlled trials showed reduction in energy intake for the low energy sweeteners compared to sugar free ad libitum feeding. Um, so and that's where they get their headline, because the takeaway that most people would articulate from this is that when you have artificial sweeteners, you're going to eat less. And that is to combat a headline where a few years ago, maybe predating this, research started coming out, or at least anecdotal evidence that, hey, the more artificial sweetener you consume, the heavier you are. There was actually a pretty large study on that, just a longitudinal study. And so I think this was, if I have the dates correct, this was in relation to that, to see if that were actually true. Um, so just me looking at this after hearing such conclusive remarks about this systematic review, I thought, man, that doesn't seem that convincing, what they're proposing here. So I thought I would dig in a little bit. Um, so one of the things that I do is I skipped all the way down past the citations, which there were many, couple hundred, and I thought, okay, let's see who actually did this study. Let's see, was it a university? Was it a bunch of grad students, for a grade? What was it? I was surprised, but then afterwards not, to show or to discover that this entire study was funded and even purported by a group that you can see their sponsors here. Those are all chemical companies. Those are all chemical companies who also have food divisions. And I'm going to let you, I'm not going to make any conclusions. If you want to look these up, you can look these up. But I will say that in some of these, when you look at somebody like Dow or Cargill, that often have things like herbicides and pesticides, as well as food products, they are chemical companies, and you can make more than one type of chemical. That doesn't bother me. But because they often get hit so hard, think of all the controversy and the conspiracies around somebody like Monsanto's, that a lot of times they just start hiding some of those subsidiaries. This is a parent company who has this company, and this company has this subsidiary, and they do this, and pretty soon they're putting so many layers that they're burying some of those things they don't want the public to see. Anyway, just interesting note that this whole study was not done by what I would call a quasi unbiased medical institution or health science research facility. It was funded by chemical companies who produce artificial sweeteners. So take that for what you will. Let's go on into the animal studies. So they divided this into three sets. When these quote, I have to kind of say quote researchers now, um, divided, looked at all of the particular inclusion criteria, and they found the ones that they wanted to include. I like the way actually that they divided these up. They looked at long-term compulsory consumption of low energy sweeteners on body weight and energy intake, voluntary consumption, which is interesting. I'll talk about that when it comes up. And then this is also another one that I really like that they included, predicting the sweetness of something, because I'm going to show you some research on just taste receptors and how that impacts long-term dopamine craving and so forth. So uh, again, I thought this was really good. If you're going to do a meta-analysis or a systematic review, start breaking it up and comparing apples to apples, like I mentioned. Here's an interesting caveat, though, that I've heard as a pro, and I'm going to propose it may be a con. Um, in all of these animal studies, they use 10 to 100 times the acceptable upper daily limits for human consumption. And because a lot of these things have been conspiratorially implicated with cancer and other health issues and all that. So I'm not exactly sure why, when you're conducting research, you would give a lab rat 100 times or even 10 times the amount that any human would consume. Nonetheless, that now has to factor into how we interpret some of the research. As a matter of fact, the higher the dose in these animal studies, the more actual body weight loss. So you have to ask yourself, well, if you're consuming more of this, why is it that you would actually lose more? That's certainly not addressed in this kind of a study. There's no randomized control study, looking at every physiological process. But when we get into the gut microbiome and so forth, you may draw some inferences. In 7 out of 10 voluntary consumption studies, body weight significantly increased with low energy or artificial sweetener consumption. So let me repeat that. This meta-analysis states that we have conclusively proven that artificial sweeteners do not cause weight gain, and they do not cause you to increase hunger-driven energy intake. But 7 out of 10 voluntary consumption studies showed significant body weight increase when they consumed more. So voluntary consumption studies were this: instead of pre-dosing these animal subjects with an exact amount, again 10 to 100 times upper daily limit consumption levels, they just said, here it is. If you want some, go ahead and have some. In this cage with these rats, here is a sugary drink mix. And over here with this cage, these rats have access to an artificial sweetener drink mix. You can just consume whatever you want, whenever you want. Just drink at will next to your water. You can drink water or that. And then you're going to have an ad libitum test. And we're going to see, which rats actually consume more. And it was the ones, 7 out of 10 studies showed, or 7 out of 10, yes, studies showed that when they were put in more of a human environment, because we're like that, right? Nobody's dosing you with 100 times the upper daily limit of aspartame or sucralose every day. Nobody's doing that. You get to consume what you want. These rat models in those studies, went that direction. So completely counter to what they purported in their conclusions and even the title of the study. But that's not all. Remember, we have more than 100 randomized control trials. We have a lot of other research, but that was just one that I think, we should note, put that on the scoreboard. In 14 out of 21 sweetness learning models, body weight increased. So the sweetness learning model was looking at the question that is often very controversial in our artificial sweetener conversations, that, hey, you get this little sweetness, aspartame's 200, 300 times sweeter than sugar, and so it just makes you hungrier, really gets into that mesolimbic dopaminergic system, and you just consume more. Well, they tested that too. And in 14 out of 21 studies where they actually trained these mice with either artificial sweeteners or sugar, 2/3 of them actually increased body weight from the low energy sweeteners. So again, it's like, wow, for a meta-analysis that concluded this thing, we now have a lot of research showing the exact opposite. That's of note to me, at least. So now into the human studies, this is where, especially in the randomized control trials, they were able to put their flag in the ground and prove to, some certainty their conclusion. 5 out of 12 studies showed higher risk of obesity associated with low energy sweeteners. So there you go. 5 out of 12. Finally, at least they're under 50%. So finally, they have one group of studies that show what they say they showed, but the others are still on the scoreboard. 6 showed a lower risk, and all the risk could be attenuated by mitigating circumstances. So they talked about some different things like sex differences, male versus female, age differences, young males versus young females, children. There were quite differences, reported between. As a matter of fact, here's another one. All studies reported only low energy sweeteners in drinks, not foods. And we have a lot of those in foods now. And so the reviewers, even these reviewers of this meta-analysis with the human studies, they ended up, after all of that, concluding we really can't prove anything. Like the human studies that we have aren't really showing us anything. So we almost have to just kind of chalk that up to a neutral part of the review. So now into the randomized control trials, which sometimes are a gold standard of research because they're incredibly mechanistic. You, in a very tightly controlled environment, you do this, you measure this. And so, especially with the more subjects you have, the tighter the controls are, you can really, quote, prove something. Except, remember, even those often don't stand the test of when you throw it into an entire organism in the wild, what really happens. In our last Nutrition Coaching Global Mastermind, Dr. Eric Helms, research fellow uh, in New Zealand, talked about how that's what got us in trouble with thinking that the growth hormone model of hypertrophy was true. Mechanistically, in randomized controlled trials, we can prove this causes growth hormone increase, therefore that must cause hypertrophy. And we found out after decades of believing that nah, actually that's totally wrong. But because we could isolate down to the smallest little mechanistic study, this plus this equals this, and then you extrapolate it and say that's how it must happen in the whole human genome, then that's often not true. That's why we need the longitudinal studies, we need the epidemiology studies, etc. But nonetheless, randomized control trials, they are important. They show us very, very specific things. So they included 9 studies in their inclusion criteria, 5 of which were exclusively with overweight and obese subjects. They ran all the way from 10 days to 1 year. But in this particular set, these 9 studies were less than 1 day. In other words, it was kind of one exposure. Like here, we're just going to do it. We're going to test it a day and we're done. 3 of those 9 studies showed a significant decrease in energy expenditure, or I'm sorry, energy intake with the consumption of low energy sweeteners, so artificial sweeteners. So 3 studies showed significant decreases, meaning great, drink all the Diet Coke you want, it's awesome. 3 studies showed no difference. 3 studies stated it couldn't be determined. So it's again, it's like, what are we really proving here? And that's not incongruent with normal science. I mean, that's why we do multiple studies. That's why we interpret research and we say, man, I wish I would have looked at that. Maybe we'll do another study that does look at that. Well, they didn't do it in this context. Maybe we need to do this. Well, they did. There's subjects like these 5 were all with obese people. What about high energy, high training, elite athletes? That could be a totally different thing. So again, just like I showed you a few slides ago, where the reviewers had to say with the human trials, like we couldn't even make any conclusive judgments. This, 3, and 3 out of 9 shows, we're not really going to hang our hat on anything. Now, the LES, or low energy sweeteners, did show the smallest weight gain or the largest loss. So this is where they really, really did draw their conclusions, especially when you look at the amount of subjects involved in these studies. They were able to say with this many subjects, we know that the ones that consumed the low energy sweeteners in study after study after study after study, they were always the ones in these randomized control studies that either lost weight or gained the least. But, and here's the biggest caveat I want to show you guys today, it was highly, highly skewed toward the low energy sweeteners versus sugar. And there are many ways we compare these and many ways we consume these as human beings. So if you were to give a child or an adult, male, female, obese person or not, an infusion of some sort of a high sugary drink or a low energy sweetened drink, artificial sweetener, and then in those ad libitum trials of them just monitoring how much they would consume, it tended to be that the people who consumed the most sugar then had the most weight gain. Okay, we're talking about weight gain. So you've already preloaded these people with sugar. Sugar has what? Calories. Sugar does what in your body? Makes you release insulin, which is an anabolic event. Uh, and then you're ad libitum putting food in front of them. We know that a super high dose of sugar will tend to drive hunger. So depending on how these studies were actually carried out, I don't think that's really changing my world much. You're telling me that somebody who consumes high sugar is gaining more weight than the people who had the artificial sweetener as a pre-dose. And then uh, I would say that if I could compare it to what I'm going to discuss later when it comes back to dopamine and the hypothalamus, um, there is a split, and maybe it is contextual and dose dependent on how much sugar you consume. Because if I'm eating a meal and I have 25 or 30 grams of sugar or high glycemic carbohydrates, maybe that increases my blood sugar enough that it dampens the hunger cues from the hypothalamus, and I'm just not that hungry anymore and I'm fine. But you know how when you start binging on sugar, then as soon as the blood sugar levels come down, you're even more ravenous and it creates that kind of cycle. So there is a continuum to this, but again, comparing it to a pre-dosed pre-ad libitum feeding of either consuming sugar or artificial sweetener, and then saying over one day, these people were eating a little bit more or gaining weight over time, which we'll see in the next RCTs. I guess I would kind of expect that. That doesn't really give me a lot of indication that low energy sweeteners are therefore better. Matter of fact, let's look at that single caveat here. On this particular graph, you'll see what I just described, low energy sweeteners actually created a decrease. Here's neutral, this dotted line here is 0. So they consumed less. And over here, low energy sweeteners in capsules. So now we're taking the taste receptors and sweetness out. They still consumed less. And I've seen both sides of this controversy actually take that as a win. The people who would say that artificial sweeteners do not cause a a hunger issue, it does not cause you to be hungrier later, etc., would say, look, when we put it in a capsule, again, 10 to 100 times the upper daily limits of human consumption. When we put that much directly in the gut, bypassing taste receptors, then those people still ate less. So that's a win for us. I would say, and I wouldn't put myself in either camp, you're putting something in your body. I mean, those that is inertly some material. It may be low energy, meaning low calorie, and it may be highly concentrated as a sweetener, which we're now ignoring because it didn't pass, through the palate. But it does show something is happening internally because you have something maybe volumetrically or even just chemically triggering some kind of receptors in the gut that hunger did go down a little bit. So that's good information. But look what happens when we compare it to low energy sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, versus something that's just unsweetened. Like here's a bowl of oatmeal with Splenda, here's a bowl of oatmeal with nothing. Here's a low energy sweetener like a Monster drink or a Red Bull versus just water. Let's look at having that low energy drink versus nothing at all, just consuming nothing. Look what happens. All of a sudden, we're at dead neutral with water, or now the people consuming nothing sweet at all, either sugar or an artificial sweetener, they're the ones actually doing a little bit better. So I'm again, I'm not convinced that there's nothing yet here compelling that tells me that, wow, we've had it wrong. Artificial sweeteners are actually good for you. They cause weight loss, as is purported here, or they're even neutral. I think we need more information. So let's keep going. So here's what we did 3 years ago in our first research review pass on this topic It was another meta-analysis, artificial sweeteners as a cause of obesity, weight gain mechanisms, and current evidence. So something you can look up. This was published by the Harvard T. Chan School of Public Health. It was actually in 2018, so a little beyond this. So anyway, let me pull out some of these notes. So first of all, we have to go back to just understanding a little bit of the physiology. So in the brain, what's happening when we have something that tastes sweet? Why did we even create these artificial sweeteners? Obviously, it's because we want something to taste good, but what would the problem be? Sugar hits the taste receptors. You have this gustatory reflex, and then there's memory involved, hippocampus, and you get the mesolimbic reward system. You start releasing serotonin. That's why sugar has been related to cocaine and things like that as far as being addictive. And you start getting all of the precursors to dopamine. And then you have created something pleasurable. All that to say that this is good. You know it's good. It tastes good. It gives you pleasure. And so it makes us seek that out. This is the food reward pathway. So why wouldn't something that's just as sweet as sugar, whether it is sugar or not, why would it not do the same thing? It does. It just does. You consume something that's an artificial sweetener, and it gives you that exact same triggering of the exact same mechanisms. But there's one single problem. When we do this, and when this starts creating the digestive process, as Pavlov noted, you could even just smell or taste food, and all of a sudden, all of this stuff starts happening as your body's preparing for digestion and assimilation of nutrients. One of the things that happens is that as blood sugar increases, then this system gets tamped down. The hypothalamus actually turns off the hunger cues. That's called fullness. That's called, um, you know, being sated by the food you consumed. But when you consume artificial sweeteners, we know that doesn't happen. That was an important part of this kind of research is you don't see these massive insulin fluctuations and you don't obviously there's no blood sugar fluctuation because there's no sugar in it. So you trigger these neural mechanisms of hunger and more pleasure seeking through food. Remember in the wild evolutionarily we are crafted to actually go, seek more. That's why when you get that first taste, you want to dive in, and we have a hard time slowing down our eating, chewing more slowly, stopping after one serving or something. All those behavioral cues that we tell ourselves in trying to control our appetite, biologically, that's not there. That's psychologically our response to try to be responsible. Biologically, your brain is saying, keep fucking eating. Like this food is here. Let's go. You don't know when you're going to get it again. So when you consume the artificial sweeteners, that is triggered, yet you don't have, especially as we're talking about just some of these drinks that are non-caloric, you just don't have that mechanism to turn that back off as you would with actual food or calories. So again, in the brain, that's what's happening. That's my first point on this slide, as well as the fact that phenylalanine, which is one of the breakdown components of aspartame specifically, not sucralose or saccharin or anything else, is a precursor of if we have catecholamine neurotransmitters, which actually directly increase hunger. So it not only does what I just said with the dopaminergic system, it is literally a biochemical precursor to drive even more hunger. So anecdotally, when you or somebody else says, man, the more Diet Mountain Dew I drink or the more artificial sweeteners, like I just get hungrier, that's probably true for those two neural mechanisms that I just mentioned. I certainly, as I've told you, I would have some anecdotal stories. I certainly am one of those people that happens to. I notice all the time, especially in a calorie deficit, when I'm controlling food and meal spacing very tightly. Food sources are very high quality. All I have to do is consume a small amount, and it really drives hunger noticeably, including hypoglycemia. Hey, everybody watching this on the playback, you may notice a little glitch. We had a big regional internet outage. So I had to move to my home office and unfortunately drop everybody who was on the call and just try to pick up. And I was at a point where I'm going to be doing some summary notes anyway. So instead of re-recording the whole thing, I thought I would just stitch it together. So one of the points I was just making is that despite what this particular study or systematic review tried to do, I think we need to cut it up into a lot more categories. We need to make sure that we look at what they're really concluding, what's in the data that we can truly extrapolate for practical use. But it's not entirely, as I said, conspiratorial. I don't think there's anything super nefarious. I mentioned that obviously this is funded by an organization that purports to be a science agency. You can make your own judgments on that. But good data is good data if it's collected properly. And as it's presented here, my interpretations may be a little bit different than theirs. But I am certainly not going to get to a point where I tell you, something is completely one way or the other. I think there's going to be a lot more application to different contexts. So let's just continue with the last couple slides here. As I said, the low energy sweeteners, they do end up having a lot of impact to the gut microbiome. You can look at a lot of individual research on this that certainly was not covered in the meta-analysis we're describing. But even to the point where they have harvested the microbiome, the bacteria of people who ingest a lot of aspartame, specifically for studies, transfer that to other people, and they end up with some of the same symptoms. And we know that is very true with microbiota, just from other research in other topics. A lot of things are genetically transferred from that. That's why it's such an incredibly unknown and blooming type of research. But anyway, even glucose intolerance is, as I just said, is transferred. So you can have somebody who has normal blood sugar, normal blood markers, everything's great, and then all of a sudden, just by changing, giving them, populating their GI system with the same bacteria as somebody who consumes a lot of artificial sweetener, and all of a sudden they're having glucose intolerance issues. And some of that is because of these inflammatory factors that are increasing intestinal permeability, even over to, let me switch slides here, even liver dysfunction, not dysfunction, but change, as well as direct pancreatic insufficiency, disrupted fatty acid metabolism. And one of the things that I have always contended, I mentioned it a while ago, just because anecdotally I have experienced it so repeatedly, so consistently replicatable in my own life, but I see it with clients. Uh, just the induction of hypoglycemia from what I would call kind of a rapid influx. If somebody's not consuming a lot of aspartame or Splenda or anything else, and then all of a sudden they have a big surge of it. Like you go to a theater and have 44 ounces of a diet soft drink or something, and then it's like, wow, you just feel such an impact. A lot of that is direct hypoglycemia because of these chemical substrates that I'm describing neurologically. Even the fact that in some studies they have shown 3 times increases in glucose transporters, which just lead directly to that almost hyperinsulinemia. So anyway, it's not what they were studying or even looking at in this particular, systematic review, but I think it's worth looking at and knowing. So in conclusion, what do we take away from this? I think if you look at it at face value, what they were trying to prove or contend against is that you have all of these stories brewing about how awful these artificial sweeteners are. They cause brain cancer, they cause this, they cause that, they make you just gain body fat. And there are even studies that show isocalorically, you give somebody the exact same calories, protein, carbs, and fats, and you just add non-calorie artificial sweeteners to somebody else's diet, and it's isocaloric, total, metabolic cart tested out as at pure maintenance calories, and they start gaining weight. So why would they do that? And a lot of it would be because of what we just went over. Some of the change in the gut microbiome, the liver, the pancreas, the neurological, hypothalamic change, etc. I think that stuff is there. It's proven. In my previous 2021 review on artificial sweeteners, I give those kind of citations. What this particular systematic review is looking at is we have all these stories out there. We're contending, as the manufacturers of these things, and maybe just people who want to hope it works. I mean, if I drink 8 Diet Cokes a day, I want to think this is okay. If I'm trying to lose weight and I think those help me, it keeps me away from calories. If I have an energy drink or something else, I want to think that's okay. I want that confirmation bias. I have clients who want to put 3 packets of Splenda in every cup of coffee. They want to have 6, diet drinks a day. They want to have all these things and think that they've kind of won the lottery. They can get away with it. They can be having a low sugar diet, a maintenance diet, or a calorie deficit, and still be okay because they have these vices. So there are a lot of people who just simply want this story to go away, that these may not be good for us. So they came out, and even with going back to the original slides I presented, in their own words, the fact that there's not a lot conclusive in terms of these things are bad for us. They're not causing everybody to gain weight. They're not causing everybody to have these problems. Matter of fact, some of the studies, even if less than half of them, are showing, hey, they actually may be good. Longitudinally or epidemiologically, just the fact that somebody can use these things instead of sugar, because those are the studies that most show that it can be helpful. They're showing it may not be great for you. We're not even talking about health issues. We're not talking about these physiological changes in different organ structures. We're just saying, hey, you're probably not going to gain weight. It's probably okay to consume these. I think you can conclude that from this review. I think you can. Probably not going to hurt you. Um, as long as we're not talking about those health and physiological issues that may, because those are very nuanced and context dependent. They may be fine for some people. They may be awful for others. Depends on how they epigenetically may trigger some things in your own genome different than somebody else. But I still think there are questions. As I said, this really showed more than anything that low energy sweeteners versus sugar, uh, take the low energy sweetener. That's where you're going to not be gaining body fat. Those are the studies that concluded that. But as I said earlier, I don't know if that really proves anything, because I don't know a lot of people, if they didn't have that Diet Dr. Pepper, who would have regular Dr. Pepper. They would just find something else. I don't know, maybe just water. Maybe that's what they would do. I just it's just not necessarily for our particular neck of the woods when it comes to the nutrition industry. If somebody is definitely used to consuming tons and tons and tons of high sugar drinks, remember a lot of these studies, one entire category didn't even talk about or test artificial sweeteners in foods. They were just looking at the beverage industry. So yeah, again, instead of Coke, have Coke Zero. I have no problem with that, as long as you understand any health implications that may be there. But because the low energy or artificial sweeteners against water or against nothing, they improved nothing. That was a wash or better for the people consuming nothing or not having those. As I said, I don't even think you're looking at the right end of the horse when you're doing these random controlled trials with 10 to 100 times the upper daily limits. Um, I would like to see them do them with normal amounts. Take the person who has 3 drinks a day, or 10 instead of 10 times, how about 10%? And see, is that a problem? Is this really dose dependent? So, that's my overall conclusion. I'm, again, not going to say I'm taking a position that they are the worst thing you could ever do. In full disclosure, I have artificial sweetener in my diet probably every day. I average about a half an energy drink a day, and that's it. That's it. I don't put anything in my oatmeal. I don't put it in my coffee, my tea. I just, I'm not jonesing around looking for something sweet all the time, but just for a break from drinking water, usually something in the afternoon. I may have an energy drink some of it, put it back in the fridge until the next day, just because I want some flavor between drinking water. Uh, Again, dose dependence. I will stop with just a couple of anecdotal stories, and I've told these before, but in a couple, maybe handful, I'll give you two or three of my top 10 stories with artificial sweeteners. I had a gentleman one time who just was a competitive bodybuilder, pro bodybuilder, was kind of at a stuck point in his diet, and nothing was happening. We're looking for all of the things we would normally try to check out and mitigate. And he said, "Well, hey, the longer I've gotten in this diet, the hungrier I am, I've ended up using a lot more artificial sweetener." And he counted it up, and he was consuming about 35 packets of sucralose Splenda a day, oatmeal, coffee, everything else, about 35. And when I brought this kind of information, this kind of question to him, like, I don't know, it may be impacting you more than it would impact somebody else, seems to be something worth addressing. He went cold turkey, lost 17 pounds over the next 3 weeks. Obviously, we're not losing 17 pounds of body fat, but something, as we talked about in some of the slides earlier, where somebody even consuming capsules of artificial sweeteners that may, going back to that 10 to 100 times the upper daily limit dose, maybe 35 packets a day is in that range. And just for whatever is, that gut load and so forth, where it causes some people to be less hungry, maybe it was disrupting his gut microbiome to a level that was, causing some issues. Obviously, there was some kind of water retention happening there. It could be somewhat glucose sparing, so he wasn't as glycogen depleted and having that kind of water turnover that you would see metabolically. But regardless, that's one story, one anecdotal story. Another one very similarly, a very nice older lady who was a retired school teacher, had never dieted before, came to me. She loses 30, 35 pounds. She's cruising along. Everything's great. Life is wonderful, losing about a pound a week. And then we hit one of those plateaus, and even adjusting calories and adjusting for metabolic adaptation, we just hit a point where I'm like, I don't know, man. I am really knocking my head up against a wall trying to figure something out for you. She even came in for just an in-person consult to go over food logs and so forth. And she said, I've never in my life had diet soft drinks, never. But since I've been dieting, I got in the habit, and now I'm up to 5 Diet Cokes a day. And this was back a few years ago, but I said, again, maybe worth checking out. Maybe that is having an impact. I can't tell you there's any scientific validity to it. Certainly, it was before a lot of this research. And she also said, well, maybe I'll just cut it out and see what happens. Again, boom, instantly starts dropping weight again. With that being the only change. I can tell you guys that just time after time after time after time, not everybody. I know some people, maybe it's based on metabolic capacity, some genetic nuance that we're not sure about. Um, this just happens a lot when it comes down to finding the one thing that may be, harming somebody's potential progress. This has often come up. But more than that, what I see for people is what we just talked about in the physiology, where when they reduce their use of artificial sweeteners, they just have a lot less hunger, a lot more stable blood sugar, less hypoglycemia, if any at all. And those are things I've even experienced over and over and over myself, even to the point of headaches. Again, dose dependent. If I all of a sudden have a big influx, I just know it's very inflammatory, per some of the things I showed you here. Anyway, I'm not taking a stand again where I said, you should or should not do this. These kind of things, I think, are going to keep the controversy and the question going. I just detest it when people dogmatically say, that's total BS, or look at this systematic review. They totally prove this. I hope I have helped you see that not a lot is actually concluded with this. So if anybody wants to educate me further, if you guys have other research or different interpretations of this, I'd love to have those conversations. Um, but I would just ask you, make sure you come well prepared with not just the right kind of information and research citation, but an ability to look at it in the entire big picture like I've tried to here. So we'll see you guys next time. Appreciate you being with us in the Flexible Dieting Institute in our monthly research review.